Welcome, everyone. It's nice to have you here joining us for this seventh, believe it or not, uh, professional development seminar or working artist seminar, as they are sometimes referred to. I am Luis Antonio Pichardo, the founder and executive director of DSTL Arts, for those that aren't familiar. This, of course, is the seminar where we discuss funding and how to get your work basically, started off the ground, so to speak. And throughout, I will be obviously giving different kinds of tips and things that I have used as both a grant writer and as a independent artist working on my own as well. So these are things that I have put into practice and things that I have brainstormed on various occasions with other artists that I've had the pleasure of working with. And for those of you logged in on Zoom, you can, of course, use the chat, and I'll answer your questions there. So as we get going for today's seminar, I'd like to do a very brief check-in with those of you that have been following along. And I'd like to know, up to this point, what have you learned about being a creative entrepreneur through these various professional development seminars? What are some of your takeaways that you've had up to this point? You can obviously use the chat. You can also unmute and just share. Or maybe Abraham, do you have anything that you specifically would like to call out as one of my co-instructors?
You repeat the question?
Yeah, of all the things that we've covered over the last 7 months in these seminars, what's one of the things that for you maybe has stood out the most?
Well, I think we have covered a lot of the material, so I think it's more of the presence on the online and how to get your work out. I think that's the most important thing right now. And so people can find you first and find whatever you're doing. So I think that's the main one so far. And still working on that. I think even DSTL Arts is trying to figure out ways to reach more people.
Yeah, that's true. The online presence is always a challenge and an opportunity, of course. And yeah, welcome, Denise. I hope I'm saying that right, Denise, on Instagram. Glad you could join us for today. Eric wrote in the chat on Zoom, it takes time and dedication, and there's been lots of learning. Yeah, definitely time and dedication. That's one of the key things that we do generally bring up on a regular basis. The question on Instagram is about hiring artists of underrepresented communities, as our page says. Yeah, so to answer that question, as part of our mission statement, which is to inspire, teach, and hire emerging artists from underserved communities, we do that in a variety of ways. One of them being actually having teaching artist internships that are conducted through our Poet Artist Development Program. So that's one way in which we do so. We also periodically contract artists to create cover art for us, or in the case of, like, say, our professional development seminars, that's also how we help people, with the workforce development aspect of our mission. Hope that answers your question. You can also find out more if you go to our website at dstilarts.org. Anyone else have any specific things that have stood out to them over the last 7 months? Maybe Nabor, you have anything that's stood out to you?
I think a big part of my time with y'all, and then you, Luis, emphasizing in the spaces, centering our overall intentions and what we want at the end of the day, what stories what we want to tell as folks who are may be impacted or are impacted in different ways, whether it be our own lived experience or identities. I think you, at least from what I've gathered, is the importance of storytelling with meaning and value, and then hopefully that will also be received by the folks that you share similar experiences with, and it lands with them.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It's obviously one of the reasons why I feel like I needed to start DSTL Arts as an organization. It was about having more stories that are not your average story being told, and for a lot of reasons, it's also important that we give, especially artists who come from backgrounds like yours and mine, where we give each other these spaces where we can tell our stories, where we can ultimately, especially in the environment that we're living in right now, we want to humanize the communities that we come from. So that's, I think, a great insight on your part, Nabor. To kind of do a quick little review on at least the last session that we did. There's the larger discussion about your intellectual property, and telling your stories is very important, but it's also really, really important to protect your stories. And in that way, intellectual property and understanding what that means is absolutely key to ensuring that you as an artist are protected, that our community is protected in its own way, and that you have opportunities beyond just the simple creation of your artwork. So as we covered last month, there's licensing. You always want to license your artwork, whether that be, visual art or digital art, creative writing, whatever that case is, you want to license it. Do not sell it. Because if you sell your rights, you are putting yourself at a disadvantage. And there's a lot of different ways in which you can go about doing that. I won't go too in depth on it because we did talk about that last month. And if you want to review that, you can always watch the video. And for those of you in the PAD program, you can, of course, download the handout and watch the video on our Google Class. Another thing that we covered a lot last month was our publishing agreement and how DSTL Arts goes about publishing work, and some of the very important clauses to keep in mind, such as like what we had talked about a lot actually last month, which was the escape clause, and how to be able to retain your rights for your work, while obviously making sure that the publisher is protecting the work, representing the work in a way that you want, and giving you the ability to potentially stop the production of a book if necessary, which unfortunately we did have to discuss a little bit with some of our past mentees last month, who, worked with other publishers that shall go unnamed for the time being. But again, here's an example of our publishing agreement and what those of you in the PAD program could potentially expect in the next month or so. And we also talked about the work for hire contract and some of the things that are really useful to have on a work for hire contract. The work for hire contract itself is something that you may be actually offered as a contracted artist, but this is also something that you may have to develop at some point, because let's face it, not all of us are proficient in all the art forms that exist. So sometimes it's to your benefit to work with an artist that is proficient in an area that you could potentially use help with. So this is a sample work for hire contract that I recommend that all of you look at and potentially modify if you need it in your future creative practice. And of course, I have it in Spanish as well for those of you that might need it in Spanish. Now, kind of touching on what Nabor was saying, we do have this month's quote, which comes from Simon Sinek, specifically taken from his book, Start With Why, How Great Leaders Inspire Everyone to Take Action. And for those that don't know who Simon Sinek is, he was born October 9th, 1973, and is a British-American author and inspirational speaker. And he is quoted as saying, "People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And what you do simply proves what you believe." Exactly what Simon says. So what does this make you think of? How do you interpret what Mr. Sinek is saying here? Eric responded in the chat, "I think it goes back to the storytelling aspect. It's not just about doing, but the reasons as why you're doing it." Anyone else have a response to the quote that we have up on the screen right now. Erica in the chat wrote, "You have to have passion." Yeah, I think that does play a role in that. Denise in the Instagram chat wrote, "It reflects the human connection." Yeah, the human connection is very important, especially when we talk about our artwork. Anyone else have any thoughts on what Simon Sinek is saying? All right. Well, if you do have any other thoughts on it, you're obviously welcome to share them in the chats. Let's go ahead and continue on. Okay, Navor says, "I think it goes back to longing for connection." Yeah. Connection is absolutely important. People, as it says right here, don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. If you think about even the products that you purchase or the companies that you find a sense of loyalty for, you are doing it because of what they stand for. There's a lot of people that have been boycotting Target, for example, because they've been very wishy-washy about their policies around diversity and inclusion and all of that. And because of that, because of their wishy-washiness, they're showing that they maybe don't stand for that. Therefore, people are not buying directly from there, and the stances that people take, whether that be online or through their artwork, that will impact, obviously, why people are going to engage with you and your artwork. Yeah, don't buy at Target or Starbucks, as per Abraham, or McDonald's. Yeah. We could obviously talk a lot about all the different kinds of boycotts and all the corporations out there that are maybe not the best or socially responsible. But as we apply this to ourselves as artists and as entrepreneurs, that's really important that we consider. The things that you put out into the world are going to be engaged with more because of the story that even goes behind it, not just the story that it tells, right? So that's something to consider. And the reason why we're going to consider that is because as a small press, we do focus a lot on publishing. Publishing takes on a lot of aspects of, the media environment, including music publishing and app publishing, video game publishing. Those are all different forms of publishing that center on the arts. But as a small press that publishes chapbooks, literary chapbooks mostly, we're going to do a little bit of looking at self-publishing. And it's always useful to understand the cost of self-publishing or publishing in general, whichever medium you choose. Now, all of the things that you see here are averages. They're not set numbers, but these might be some of the things that you would invest in as an independent artist if you were going to self-publish a book, something similar to the chapbooks that you've been working on over the past 8 months now. And that could include things like the cover design. You might want to pay someone independently of you to create the cover art for your work, because frankly, people judge books by their cover. And whether or not the book cover itself is appealing, that's subjective. But in that subjectivity, there's going to be a response, right? And the cost of paying someone to do your cover art could be anywhere from like $600 to $2,000, depending on the graphic designer that you're working with or the visual artist that you're working with to create the artwork. I mean, you can do the typesetting yourself, but the actual visual elements themselves, that could vary greatly depending on whether or not you're paying someone professionally to design the work. It's also useful to have, an eye on editing. You can help people judge less if they hire Navor. Nice. Yeah, exactly, Navor. Put that out there. And that is going to be one of those things that we'll actually talk about in a moment. But to continue on with the cost of publishing a book, it's also useful to potentially pay someone to help you edit your work, right? A fresh set of eyes can sometimes catch things that are either misspelled or grammar typos, that type of thing. But also, if you're working in, like, say, nonfiction or something that uses factual evidence in your writing, that fact checking is also really, really important. And an editor could help you with that. Um, Editing or copy editing itself can vary in price a lot depending on the size of the manuscript, but you could easily spend anywhere between $300 to $2,000 per manuscript. So that's something to consider. And then also the formatting of a book, right? The way that the book itself is designed. That could include the cover design, so the price can vary a lot. But even if you're making, like, say, a handmade zine, I have spent at minimum $25 on paper and other materials to make handmade zines. And so, it could range greatly when it comes to the formatting of a book. And if you need to do something more specialized, like an ebook, sometimes that requires a different approach to graphic design that you may end up deciding that you want to invest in with a professional graphic designer. So again, the price can range a lot, up to $3,500 even, or more. Promotion is something that you could probably do in, a very free 99 kind of way. But there's also the opportunity to set up events, that you could put together for free in partnership with a bookstore. There's, vending opportunities at places like the LA Zine Fest, or even if you want to invest in a booth at the LA Times Festival of Books or other large events. I mean, that can range in price greatly. But at minimum, I would recommend that you consider even paying occasionally for boosted posts on social media. It's one way in which people still engage with work, and it's, whether you like it or not, a useful use of social media, in this digital age of ours. There's also things like having a website, maintaining a website. And as we covered in our previous seminar on website design, you could be spending at least $175 a month or a year, on just maintaining a simple website with a simple URL that, doesn't have, like, say, weebly.com/DSTL Arts, right? Like, you could have the actual DSTLArts.org URL as opposed to those free ones. And that can also, when we talk about author tools, include things like professional development seminars or membership dues if you're part of a membership program, or union, like we had talked about previously as well. Those kinds of things are investments in yourself, and therefore they are tools that you can use to promote a book. Also, most people don't realize it, but an ISBN, if you want to officially register your book with most places, you do need to have an ISBN, and an ISBN is also necessary if you are going to be registering something like a CD, musical album. You can use an ISBN for digital books, and each version of a publication requires its own independent ISBN number. So, they're $125 each if you buy them individually, but there are bulk discounts if you decide that you want to buy them in bulk, whether that be 10 ISBN numbers or up to 100 ISBN numbers at a time. You can do that and get a pretty decent discount, depending on obviously how many you think you need. Yeah, like bulk ordering from Costco. There's also copywriting fees, which we did talk about previously, and it is useful to invest in the copyright fee. It could be anywhere from $45 up to $125 per registration. And kind of like we discussed last month, those registrations last for your entire life. So it's a one-time fee for your entire life, plus 70 years past your death, which means that those copyrights can be passed on to your family as part of your estate, meaning that those individuals could potentially continue to capitalize on your legacy as an artist. There's obvious benefits to that, And I strongly recommend that you add that as part of your budget for any type of artwork that you are creating. The question from Eric in the chat says, so does print of the same book have a different ISBN than a digital copy of the same book? Yes, that's correct, Eric. So a physical book will have one ISBN number, and then an ebook version of that same book will have a separate ISBN number. And if you also do an audio book, that will also have its own ISBN number. So if you're going to do the trifecta of physical media, digital media, and audio digital media, you need the 3 different ISBN numbers. So that is a very good question, Eric. Thank you for asking that. In the end, if you add up these average costs, you will see a pretty big spread of either, about $1,000 up to $8,000, depending on, the investment that you're making on your self-published book. Plus whatever annual fees you are investing in, which again can include things like your website hosting. It could include membership dues as part of a union. It could include even, marketing and how much you spend on your marketing budget a year. So those things are obviously going to fluctuate. Plus, there's also variable costs in printing, distribution, shipping, and storage. Because if you're going to have physical media, you do need to find a way to store it. And if you have a very small space like I do, you may have to invest in a storage unit or some other way in which you can actively, manage your stock, your inventory, and also manage the shipping and handling costs that go with that. I'll do a separate seminar on that and how to manage your own mini press if that's something that all of you are interested in. But for today, we're not going to get too deep into those other logistical things. And let's see. Navor asked in the chat on Zoom, I was wondering if y'all ever published a monograph of those different versions, physical, audio, etc. No, honestly, in the past, it's been a little too difficult to manage the distribution of digital ebook versions of our chapbooks, plus the added cost of formatting specifically for digital, that can be a little tricky, especially if you wanted to have proper readability on most devices. PDFs themselves are easy enough to read on most devices. However, for it to be accessible for people that need to use it or read it using, like, say, assistive technology, for the visually impaired, there's additional things that need to go into the digital version of a book. So those costs are, again, adding complexity and therefore make the title itself that much more expensive. So up to this point, we've created PDFs of like our Conchas y Café zine, Art Block zine. So those zines are available as digital downloads. But the chapbooks themselves that we produce through the PAD program, no, we haven't really been able to afford that. And that actually brings me to the next slide. This is a sample of our budget for producing your specific chapbooks. So as all of you know in the program, you've been working on your chapbook, and we tell you to kind of aim for 60 pages, right? That's the typical length of a chapbook. In order for me to be able to properly budget that and plan for that, I need to give myself up to 120 pages of physical space to be able to accommodate up to 60, sometimes up to 70 or even 80 pages of poetry. So if we were to produce all of your chapbooks in a 5x8 trade paperback book, whether that be in black and white or color printing, the economy version of it, this is actually what it more or less costs us. It's about $8 and some change, almost $9 in black and white, and almost $10 per book in color. And then you add into that cost the shipping cost from the printer for the individual books. Of course, there are bulk discounts right? So the wholesale price for the individual book is going to be higher than the discounts. There's a 20% bulk discount if we order 100 units, like we typically do for all of your chapbooks when we first produce them. So in the reality, with that 20% discount for 100 books, it comes out to approximately $730 just for the books themselves. That's the printing cost for your individual chapbooks. We have to include into that the shipping, which is pretty standard, $65 straight to DSTL Arts. So that's what this price includes. If it's black and white, or it's almost $800 for the color chapbooks that we produce. Also, I have to factor into that the staff time that it takes for me to be able to design your books too. And it's pretty typical that I spend approximately 30 hours per book designing it, which at our DSTL Arts hourly rate, $280.22 an hour. If we break it down to cover all of the expenses required to operate DSTL Arts and this program specifically, that's about an investment of $8,400 for each one of you, right? So that's how much we are investing in the development of your chapbooks just for the design and printing of your chapbooks. That doesn't include all of the hours that we spend, coaching you, reviewing your work, giving you feedback. Like there's a significant investment that we're putting into each one of you because we value you, right? That's how much we know that each one of you is worth. You're worth this and way more as artists. So in order for us to be able to have these discussions about how to go about fundraising, we need to be very transparent about the cost, right? And so the cost for at least our press, our operation, is approximately $9,200 per chapbook that gets produced by each one of you. And kind of like what I was saying about the ebooks and the added complexity there, the more complex you make a design, the more time and resources go into it. And as a small nonprofit, obviously we don't have the infinite resources that we wish we had to invest in each of you. But we are obviously very happy to have all of you in the program at this time and, working to produce something that we know is going to add value to the larger world, culturally, spiritually, all of the above, right? So that's my little two cents, my little inspirational speech for all of you. But again, this is realistic, right? This is a real world figure. And hopefully that helps y'all understand that, it's important to create a budget. I know we talked about this before, and I know that in talking about this, it can be sometimes an uncomfortable conversation, especially for those of you that are starting off as, emerging artists. But again, a budget is a roadmap, and it's going to be something that provides you with structure and guidance. And like we've talked about before, it tells the story of what you value more than anything, right? A budget is a moral document. I've said that multiple times to all of you, and I hope that all of you are still using that budget template that I had created for you many, many months ago. If you need, obviously, a refresher on how to use that particular budget tool that I created, I'm more than happy to meet with you individually, but you can also go to Google Classroom and download it, have access to it through Google Sheets, and you can always watch the video on YouTube where I review how to use it again. Does anyone have any questions so far? I know I covered a lot up to this point, but I want to take a moment to check in. How are y'all feeling so far? All right, I got a thumbs up there. Cool. It's a lot. Yeah, I know it's a lot, Erica, but but it's worth it, I promise. Well, let's go ahead and continue on. And if you have any questions at any point, obviously you can let me know. Again, I want to remind y'all though, right? A budget is a moral document. It tells the story of what you value. So if you're going to be starting your creative business, your arts practice, it's always useful to have that budget ready to go so that you can make certain decisions. One of those ways in which you can use your budget is to determine, what are the kinds of things that you need startup funding for, and what are the things that you can do to generate that money at the very beginning. Obviously, all of you are artists. All of you are here because you are a practicing artist and you have a unique skill that not everyone in the world has. And in that ability to recognize your skills from, way back in the beginning when we first did this seminar series, I talked about, what are the things that you can do in society that you can monetize ultimately. One of those things is selling your services, right? You can take commissions. And remember, we covered the work for hire contract. So you can do things that can still protect your intellectual property if you are taking visual art commissions as visual artists. But writers, you also have the ability to charge for your copywriting service. You can be a copywriter, you can be a copy editor. Copywriters are the people that typically will create writing for other purposes, usually marketing, or other approaches to telling instructions, or just storytelling in a different way, right? For typically businesses and that type of purpose. Copy editors, I know that even the best journalists in the world need copy editors. They need people that can catch the typos. And it's funny because I see typos a lot in newspapers that I subscribe to. So, there's always going to be a need for a copy editor out there in the world. And again, visual artists, y'all can be designers, y'all can be photographers and illustrators. There's a lot of uses for visual art out there. And that is a service that you can bring to the table. And the question for you is, how else can you leverage your creative skills? What are other things that you can do to sell your unique skill, your service as an artist? If you have any ideas, go ahead and drop them in the chat. I'm sure that people would appreciate, other ways in which they might be able to also offer their skills as writers and visual artists. There's also merch, of course. Who doesn't like a nice little zine or a nice little pin? Those low cost, easy to produce merchandise opportunities are other ways in which you can start creating a little bit of a startup fund for any kind of project that you might have. Yeah, exactly, Abraham. Merch. One of the things that obviously all of you in our program have access to is our mobile art lab. And through the mobile art lab, we have a large format printer and scanner that each one of you can use to reproduce mini zines. You can use it to make sticker sheets using office labels. You can do pins. We actually have a button maker that allows you to make a pin back button. So there's different ways in which you can obviously create low cost merchandise that people will find interesting, and hopefully, maybe even be enough of an incentive to have for, like, say, crowdfunding, or maybe pre-sale incentives. Really think about what can you do with office supplies and other clearance bin art supplies. I know when I used to go to Blick to buy canvas and other materials for painting, I used to love going to the clearance bin because there was always something that I could use to make some kind of like mini zine or other little merch item that at one point I was using early on in my arts career. And definitely, as Ayla says on Instagram, you can also offer things like classes and workshops, which I'll actually talk a little bit more about in a moment. But again, if you have ideas about creative ways that you can use office supplies, feel free to drop them in the chat. Also, I would recommend that y'all invest in an origami book, a book that teaches you how to do origami, because that is a very unique way of approaching a mini zine. You can tell a story through origami, and use it as a way for creating interactive artwork, in a way that people will find fascinating and potentially pay you a little bit more for than what they might expect to pay for a mini zine. Again, going to merch and talking about ways to protect yourself, it's very, very useful, especially if you're going to be working with maybe like a bookstore or a little mom and pop craft store or something, some place that sells merchandising, whatever that might be. It's useful to have a consignment agreement. A lot of places do have their own pre-existing consignment agreement, but if you're not familiar with the concept of consignment, basically you take your merchandise to a vendor that has usually a brick and mortar store, and you basically have an agreement where they sell on your behalf whatever merchandise they're going to hold for you, at a fee, right? At a cost. It's normally going to be a percentage thing. So the ones that I've seen usually are 60-40. You get 60% of the sale price, they keep 40%. And having a written agreement that lists the prices, those are going to really be able to help you ensure that you get paid the amount that you agree to receive. And it also helps to determine how long they will hold your merchandise and what to do if there are returns on your merchandise. So again, I'm not going to go into great detail on this. I highly recommend that each one of you download the handout and review it later. But this is a sample consignment agreement that you could potentially use if the mom and pop store that you're going to does not have an official agreement that they use already. And yeah, this one's fairly, ¿cómo se llama? Fairly thorough. So I do recommend that you take a look at it. Other things that you can do to help you generate funding for an artist project, as was already mentioned in our Instagram chat, you can do classes, right? You can do little pop-up events, offer a fee-based workshop. You could teach a poetry class, or you can do a short-term writing workshop. You could offer a photo walk or a photo hike. You could even go so far as to do a sip and paint session in your backyard. If you're going to do anything that involves alcohol, though, in full transparency, I strongly recommend that you get insurance, general liability insurance, and that you invest in getting that liquor license that allows you to do these types of events. If you're going to be advertising a sip and paint session that does have alcohol attached to it, you could see fines that I swear you do not want to have ever in your life. So just be aware of that, right? But again, that is a possibility, right? If it's maybe a thing that you do just amongst friends or people that are very close to you, again, doesn't matter how close they are, invest in insurance and invest in the liquor license just to protect yourself. But in any case, that is an idea that I have seen used to great effect. You could potentially also set up a small table or an easel somewhere and offer caricature drawing or even poetry on demand. For those of you that have seen us at various events throughout the year, you know that I have a typewriter, a Smith Corona from the 60s. And that typewriter, when I bring it out, it really does bring attention to our booth. And I offer poetry on demand in my own style. And that is one way in which you could potentially, if you have the tools accessible to you, you could generate a little bit of cash, to help get a project started. But again, caricature drawings, that's always a fun one that I see people often do on their own with minimal effort, right? Minimal fees to get you started. Also, think about what other kinds of skills do you have, right? It could be something as simple as like a bake sale. The other day, I was walking along a boardwalk in Ventura, and there was a girl that was selling cupcakes. I don't know why she was selling them, but Obviously, she had access to the materials to make cupcakes, had her own little way of storing them and traveling with them. And, she, by the time that I came back around, she had sold more than half. So, little bake sales, little tamal sales. You could even do a car wash or set up a lemonade stand or even a champurrado stand when it gets cold, right? There's ways in which you can make cash that sometimes don't require a whole lot of effort, just a very small investment and another skill that you bring to the table in addition to your art. There's also bartering. For those that aren't familiar with the concept of bartering, it is when you trade a service or a skill for another service or a skill. Some people might be open to this, but of course, as much as possible, pay other creatives. There might be a collaboration that could happen between two individuals, but going back to what we talked about before and protecting your intellectual property, always use contracts. If you're going to collaborate with another artist, make it very clear who owns what intellectual property and how you are splitting the fees and the revenues that you make if this is going to be a for-profit venture. And, it's not the best option. And as a general rule of thumb, avoid the burden of debt. But if you have a project or some sort of program that is going to generate enough money, you could potentially use a zero or low interest credit card or personal loan as a way to get startup funding. Again, I do not recommend this, but it is an option. And if we don't address it, and people don't think of it as a tool, then I feel like I would be doing a disservice to you. Avoid it as much as you can, but think of it as an investment, right? And if you're going to maybe approach a family member or a friend that you trust and that they certainly trust you, you could treat it as an investment opportunity with them. And again, just like with bartering, use contracts and delineate the repayment terms and be clear about who owns the rights for the creative work that's going to be created, right? You as the artist should always own your intellectual property rights, and any kind of investment in your work should be very clearly understood that it's only an investment in the production of it, and that if they're going to be paid back, it will not include whatever royalties you make beyond the payment of the loan, right? So just be very clear about those things if you're going to be looking for personal loans in that way. You could also structure your project to be cause-based, so if it's going to be linked to some sort of community organization or some other community-based workshop series, it could potentially generate donations. Legally speaking, any donation that is made to you as an individual is technically considered a, revenue source, right? It's considered income and it does get taxed. The only way that a donation will not get taxed is if it goes to a fully registered nonprofit organization. So that's something to keep in mind. It's maybe not the best language to use if you're going to be asking for donations. So what you could potentially do to get around that is to have something like a Patreon, where it's more like a person is going to invest X amount and in return they receive a pin or a mini zine, or they get an opportunity to work with you on one element of, say, a mural. There's a lot of different ways in which you could potentially turn your project to be community-based or cause-based. And if you're going to be working with a nonprofit that is doing similar work as to the project that you are doing, then maybe you might want to explore collaborating with them. That might be an opportunity where you could work with, say, a park and do a workshop series in a park. And, if it's free for the public, even better. You're more likely to get a community-based organization to work with you if it's going to be free for the community. And there may be an opportunity to even collaborate on the writing of a grant and, getting paid through that means, right? But again, be conscious of how intellectual property works, especially if you're going to market this as a program that includes other people's artwork as part of your bigger project. If you're making a zine that is going to be community generated, then be clear that you are either going to pay the licensing fees for the work that's being submitted, or that the person maybe gets compensated in another way with, like, for example, a free copy of the final book or anthology or final zine that is being produced. Any questions so far? Or other comments? As you can see here, we will be talking a little bit about grants and fellowships. And it's kind of hard, to be honest with you, to teach grant writing, but there are some very important things that are very useful for you to understand if you are going to be writing grants and submitting applications to fellowships. They are competitive and they are time-based, almost 100% of them. And they are crucial for the survival of artists. But everyone is unique, right? Some of them are for very specific things, like the environment, for example, or mental health, and using the arts as a way to address those social issues. And some of them are very general. Some of them might be more for exploring a specific work of art, or a specific, critical theory. But whatever you do in terms of grant writing and fellowship applications, be very clear about the purpose of your project. And this basically means to always have a concise description of the goals that you hope to achieve through this project. We talked about this before. Your practice as an artist should have a type of mission statement, and that mission statement could potentially be used or adapted as a description for whatever project you're doing. Also, be very aware of who the audience is that you are serving. If it's a bilingual audience, or if it's a, AAPI audience, a very specific niche group, right? That's very useful for you to know and very useful for you to articulate in a grant application. It's also very important to have a clear timeline. How are you going to execute it? Are you ready to execute it? Can you start doing this project beginning next week? If not, is it starting in 6 months, as soon as you get the funding from the grant? If it does start then, what do you need to do to prepare for that, right? Be very, very honest with yourself about how much of an investment you need to make leading up to the execution of the project. And always be prepared with some kind of evaluation. We talked about it before. This could include surveys. This could include interviews. It could include a whole lot of different ways in which you gather feedback from the people involved. Even if it's just you, right? You reflecting on what the process was like for you to create a work of art. Have those kinds of things written down somewhere so that you can reflect on it, especially if the grant application requires some type of explanation of how you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of the funding that is given to you. And sometimes even just journaling and coming up with new ideas for how to approach the same problem can be useful for your own personal growth. So evaluations are very, very important. Included in this packet, I've actually shared with all of you our most recent grant application. This is a new application, so I can't say that it's been funded yet, but some of the elements from this grant application, these narrative questions, are questions that I've repeatedly answered in a variety of different grant applications that I've written, both as the executive director of DSTL Arts and even as an individual artist. Most grant applications will ask you to provide a brief summary, indicating how the funding is going to be used. And a lot of times it's anywhere between like 100 and 150 words. This one happens to be 135. And this specific grant application is for general operating funding from the California Arts Council. I don't have a problem with sharing this with you because ultimately these are all going to be public records anyway. So it doesn't have all of the questions that are part of this grant application, but if you want to have an idea of the kind of language that is used in a lot of these applications, I can at least highlight a few things for you. One of them being things like demographic data, right? I know the demographics of South LA and East LA very, very well, not only because of how familiar I am with the community that I'm a part of, but also because I have done enough research on the US Census website. I know that data very, very well. And those are really useful things for you to have in your back pocket when you are doing grant writing, especially if you're grant writing for things that are community based. It's also useful to have kind of like that argument of why your programs, why your particular workshops are going to be different and useful and important to the community. We don't often have bilingual workshops. We don't often have workshops that specifically support artists from communities like ours. And that's reflected in the demographics of the local creative economy. Right. So that's another piece of data that I'm putting into this. If you look at it, there will be numbers that are a part of this grant application, and that is something that I strongly recommend that all of you consider. Just again, having written down somewhere, having easily accessible for when you start writing your own grants for your own workshops. There's also questions that usually ask you about how you're going to determine progress. A lot of those questions are simply about the evaluation systems that you're going to be using. So here on this particular question, I'm not only talking about the number of workshops that we're going to be doing and the number of people that are going to be served, but also how I'm going to do that evaluation between post-workshop surveys and how many people are going to say that they really had a good time and that they learned something new. Those are useful pieces of information that a reviewer is going to be like, okay, yeah, this person is really investing the effort and the time in understanding how well they serve their community. In addition to that, though, I'm also including in here our publishing goals because DSTL Arts is a publisher. So that's another way in which we track our progress towards the goals that are stated as part of this, right? So numbers and the impact that will be felt by the community and how they can prove that or how you can prove that, those are the types of things that are useful for grant applications, right? Numbers and projections of the amount of people served. If it's an individual artist project, it might even include things like how many copies of a book you're going to be publishing or printing, how many of them are going to be distributed, and how many different ways you're going to distribute it, right? So numbers and statistics are always very useful for writing grant applications. Yeah, again, this is an application that is going to be public, so you can obviously read it through it if you want to have a better sense of how DSTL Arts goes about writing grant applications, how I've gone, over the past now, what is it? Almost 20 years writing grant applications, my approach and the type of language that I use in writing grant applications. So those of you in the program have the benefit of this. And again, be concise, right? Here, I use one paragraph, which is a compound sentence, to describe what our Conchas y Café workshops are, right? Conchas y Café Zine is the product of our biannual 15-week bilingual creative writing workshop series that presents literary concepts in an accessible, community-oriented manner, empowering participants to write, publish, and present original works in any language through our zines and corresponding readings. Super short, super concise, tells you exactly what you need to know and nothing more. All right. So that's kind of the goal, right? For any project that you're requesting funding for, always have that kind of elevator pitch approach to the descriptions. All right, so we'll move on there. But before I do, any questions about those grant application tips that I just provided? If you have a question later, you're obviously welcome to ask. Another thing, of course, is establish a budget. So really know the real cost of operating your project, whatever that might be. If it's a book, if it's a workshop series, whatever the case might be, really have a real-time budget. Also know that, no funder is ever going to award a grant, doesn't matter who they are, without really knowing how their funds are going to be used. So the budget itself is going to be a very, very important element of any grant application, especially if they're asking for one. Also, generally speaking, whether it's a good thing or not, funders always want to know and will usually favor high impact use of their funding, meaning that the more people who benefit from their funding, the better. Another way of looking at it is a dollar to participant ratio, or how much money of the grant will be invested into the participants of the program. This is more real or more true or accurate for projects that are community-based, that focus on some sort of educational outcome. They're probably not going to be the thing that you'll find on a very artist or artist project specific grant application, but honestly, the majority of funders will look favorably on any kind of grant application that uses their funding for not just your own artwork, but also, some form of community involvement. That's just been my personal experience. And to be honest with you, there's even in some grants, like an actual formula that will be part of the budget so that they can understand whether or not you're spending a particular amount, whether it's high or low is dependent on the organization, but there are instances where you will see how much individual participants are being invested in, as kind of the language says. So that's something to be aware of. And again, the budget is going to really help you determine, how really just the things that you're valuing, right? So if it's more for the community involvement and that's where you're going to spend the majority of your funding, then, that means that the person reviewing the grant is going to understand that it's really about the community and having that larger impact. Also, clear writing is a reflection of clear thinking. So whenever possible, have someone else take a look at your grant writing. Make sure that there's no typos, that you're not maybe glossing over a question, that the question isn't being maybe repeated in a way that is almost boring. And honestly, if you give it to a person and they have questions about your project, the grant review panelist will also have questions, and that's not a good thing. I've been on many grant review panels to help me develop my own grant writing skills, and I've told you all multiple times, when the opportunities arise, take them. Become a grant review panelist, and you will see how some people approach grant writing and how, the well-funded or the grants that do receive that approval, how effective they are in telling the story of why their community needs the funding and why the artists should get paid. Really, you want to leave your audience of panelists with as few questions as possible. Also, it's useful to establish community buy-in. And this can take a lot of different shapes, a lot of different forms. It could be a list of references of people that you've worked with. It could be letters of support from, like say libraries that you may have partnered with, or if you are committed to partner with another organization, you may need a letter that establishes that the partnership is real. It can also be articles or reviews or other things from third parties that show that your artwork has a particular level of impact and audience. So if you have those things, make sure that you do maintain record of them, whether that be scanning it, whether that be saving the website, whatever the case might be, always have something that establishes that your community does support you and that you have that buy-in from an audience of really various people, not just the people that come to your programs. There's also a couple of things to be aware of, one of them being that some grants do have conditions for being released to artists. The most common thing that you might come across is fiscal sponsorship. Most artists need a fiscal sponsor. And what a fiscal sponsor is a specialized nonprofit that specifically sponsors projects. They help an artist or a collective of artists manage the funding. They receive the funding on their behalf, and they sometimes, almost 100% of the time, will take a portion of the grant to help cover the administrative fees related to managing the grants. The level of management that a fiscal sponsor will have kind of depends on the fiscal sponsor, but the average cost of being under a fiscal sponsor is usually 10% of whatever grant you get. Some of them do charge an additional membership fee, but a lot of times those additional membership fees will provide you with things like professional development seminars, mentorships, and access to like networking events and other things that could be useful. But a fiscal sponsor is not going to be the organization that writes a report for you. So you, as the project manager, will still be responsible for writing a report by the end of the funding period to say, this is how the funding was used, this is what the outcomes were of the project, and you are the one that's ultimately responsible for maintaining the relationship with whichever funder you get money from. So just be aware of that. Fiscal sponsorship as independent artists is going to be very important for you to consider, especially if you do not want to go the route that I did, which is incorporating as a nonprofit. It is a legal process that will establish a specific financial structure. And depending on how you incorporate, whether that be as a business or as a nonprofit, like there's a lot of legal requirements and paperwork that need to go into that before you can do anything. And in some cases, it will cost you money to file the forms and all of that good stuff. But the important thing to remember is that if you incorporate as a business, whether that be as a sole owner or as a limited liability corporation, as a for-profit business, the only person that really could get all the profits from any kind of business ventures is you, the owner of the business, and any other shareholders that you have. So anyone that has invested in your business and owns a stake in the business, those would be the people who would theoretically benefit the most from any kind of profits that the organization makes. If you are registering as a nonprofit organization, whether that's a 501c3 or a 501c4, those two types of nonprofit organizations do not have your typical owner. They're controlled by a board of directors, and they could be managed by an executive director. But any kind of profits that the organization makes as a nonprofit organization must be reinvested in furtherance of the nonprofit's mission. So if there's ever a surplus in the funding, it all just simply continues to help the organization operate in its mission. Always will come back to its mission, right? It is labor intensive to incorporate in either one of these, and it can be costly at the very beginning, like I said. But the one thing about it is that, there's a lot of opportunities that will open up to you if you incorporate. You could get contracts as creative with other, like city entities or the county. You could even be hired by the state of California, for example, to provide filmmaking services, which is one of the things that they're currently contracting for. So as a business, you could bid on certain things, certain opportunities that you normally would not be able to bid on if you were just an independent, non-incorporated artist. If you're a nonprofit organization, then obviously there's a lot of other funding out there for you, and you can always take advantage of that as a working artist, you know. And that means that also you would be able to work with other artists, and you know, you have this structure that is allowing you to really focus on the development of your community while you're also developing your own art practice. Of course, depending on how you structure your nonprofit, but that is something that is a benefit. It is a plus. There's also, you know, other things that have been useful in my many years now of doing this. One of them being networking. So, you know, these are other things that you can do to help you. You never know who you're going to run into. A few years ago at the LA Times Festival of Books, we had a guy randomly walk up to us. And lo and behold, he was part of a foundation and he encouraged us to apply. And next thing we knew, we had a grant check in the mail that, you know, was way bigger than I had ever anticipated at the time. And it was really cool just talking to him about his comic book and, you know, how he got into creating comic books, and, you know, encouraging him to check out our programs. After he did, and I gave him our business card, next thing you know, we have funding in the mail. So networking is one of those things that, you know, you may be awkward at first, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. And if you're always prepared with a business card and you have that online presence, you have that website or a portfolio website that you can showcase your artwork on, you will be able to, you know, find other followers and people who will be supportive of your art. It's also very, very useful to actively research. Always be aware of the grant opportunities that exist and keep your budgets up to date. If you're going to be doing a program or a project that you know is going to be ongoing, try to regularly, at least once a year, update how much it costs to provide that service or how much it costs to execute that project. And always understand your audience demographics. You know, it's always going to come back to that. Who is your artwork for? You know, aside from you, who does it most represent? Who's going to be the audience that will perhaps even purchase your artwork, right? Have a good sense of who that is at all times. And whenever possible, just be prepared to adapt your project or your budget at any given time. As all of you know, right now, DSTL Arts is going through a funding shortage, you know, something that we were not fully expecting to the degree that we are experiencing right now. So I'm actively adapting our budgets and, you know, trying to make things work so that over the summer we can continue to operate, and into the fall be prepared to be able to offer our programs like we normally do. That could mean that we might have to cut back on some programs, and, you know, that includes even the Poet Artist Development Program, as I've discussed with all of you. But, you know, that's one of the benefits of being prepared, is that I can adapt it and I can still ensure that we will have support for all of you in the program currently, and, you know, any future mentees that we have will have a fair enough level of support from all of us. There's also the potential investment in going to trade events, things like zine fests or art walks or art shows or even book fairs. You know, those are perfect for marketing, and it's very useful to know who the audiences are there. They're also potentially an opportunity to collaborate with someone, whether that be in presenting your work or even splitting the vendor fees. You know, so if you don't need a full table at a zine fest, go halvesies with somebody else, and, you know, both of you can be there to represent yourselves and your work, and, you know, conduct that market research and create that buzz, as you see here. Right? There's always a benefit to going to trade events, and that's both as a vendor and as a customer. You know, you can be out there giving out business cards and giving out mini zines, and again, generating a buzz for the work that you have coming up. And just like with the, other stuff about knowing your audience, really, when you pick a zine fest or an art book fair to go to or to vend at, really know who the audience is. This little table right here is kind of like a, general overview of the audiences that we've typically seen at things like zine fests, book fairs, and other kind of trade shows. The nice thing about independent shows or readings is that they're usually free, usually very easy to set up, and they're very, very hyper local. So this is something that really will feature people that you know and probably give you a good enough turnout. But again, if you're the featured artist at another reading, then you might be going and meeting people that you don't know. And again, it's good to be out there networking. So ultimately, I won't go too in depth into this little chart that I created here for you, but there are things to consider and always plan ahead, right? Budget, think about the audience that you're hoping to reach. And in the end, as the homework says here, be prepared with that budget, and have your kind of like your vision for your career in mind as you are moving forward with not just the development of your manuscripts right now, but even the websites that you will eventually be creating and the portfolios that you're going to be adapting, right? Be prepared and have that budget ready to go so that you can begin applying to those grants as soon as possible. So there is a little bit of homework here for all of you to do. Think about your administrative and general operating costs. Really think about your project or program costs if you're going to be creating any kind of workshop series. And think about what kind of services you can provide, right? Create those revenue projections. Really understand what skills you bring to the table beyond just, your creative practice, but also other things that you can do to help you get funding to start your next big project. And if you want to have access to the budget template that I created before, again, all of you have access now on Google Classroom. And for anyone watching on our live stream or later on YouTube, you can always reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to share access with that Google Sheets template. On screen now, you can see my email address along with the email address of Abraham and Angie, who are my wonderful co-hosts and co-teachers here, my co-mentors. And of course, like and subscribe, do all the YouTube things if you're on YouTube. And if you're watching any of this, maybe on our other social media, you can always follow at DSTL Arts on, the Twitter /X, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, all that good stuff. So thank you, everyone. I know it was a lot of information. I'll hold on for a few more minutes here to answer any questions that you might have. But as for our live stream friends, that'll end our live stream. I hope y'all enjoyed. You're welcome, Denise. Thank you for hanging on for the entire session. And for those on YouTube, again, make sure you like and subscribe. And I will see you all next time.